What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey and welcome to another miniature rescue. Today we're going to get right to it and save some busted up wolf riding goblins from Games Workshop. I've painted a lot of goblins during my time in the hobby, and they have all been great minis, some of my favorites by far. The sculpts are usually fun, and given the smaller size of the models, they tend to go pretty quickly when it comes to getting them painted and on the table. Goblins offer some fun color choices as well. They're just fun models, so more often than not, fun colors work really well on them. Today, we are specifically looking at a really great set of models that are a warband for Warhammer Underworlds, a game that I've heard a ton about but still haven't jumped into. These three wolf-riding goblins come as a set called Rippa's Snarlfangs. I can't even remember when or where I got these, but they came to me in a not entirely terrible situation. A few broken pieces that need to be filed down and reattached, as well as having the paint stripped down to give them a fresh start. So a little bit of work to get them back to a good place, but nothing we can't handle. I've been really wanting an excuse to play Underworlds, and this seems like as good a time as any to get my feet wet and paint some really great models. The first thing we need to do is take care of cleanup. I'll be using my ultrasonic jewelry cleaner filled with LA's Totally Awesome and let these guys soak for a good 15-minute cycle. Once they've gotten their bath, I remove the paint using an old toothbrush. For the most part, all of the paint has come off. There's just a hint of primer left on each model, but it's so thin at this point that it really shouldn't be an issue. Once everything is cleaned up and re-primed, you won't even see any of that. The important thing is all of the other paint has been removed and the model is clean enough to paint on. Speaking of paint, I'll be using the new Army Painter 2.0 speed paints on these models today. There's actually a pretty good reason why, and it's not because they just sent them to me, which I do appreciate. I've come to a realization recently, and I have these speed paints to thank for it. Painting models is extremely rewarding, and when you get to the end of the process, it can feel really good to have a completed mini to go onto the table or in your display cabinet. And that feeling is pretty much universal regardless of the quality of the paint job on the most recent model. A finished mini is always better than an unpainted one, and it helps motivate us to the next mini or army project. So why is it that we pretty much all have a hard time just getting them painted and on the table? I think it comes down to how we, as miniature painters, are most always seeing an abundance of absolutely amazing paint jobs out there, and almost constantly too. Every time we get on Instagram or Facebook, we see models that are painted to insanely high standards, and I think as awesome as that actually is to see, it can plant a seed of doubt in our minds and stop us from making the kind of progress that we actually want. Like, somehow it matters to us that we won't be able to achieve results as good as some of those really great painters that we like. What it really comes down to, though, is it actually doesn't matter at all. When I first got into miniature painting, I only painted the models to get them onto the table. I wanted to play a game. Not once did a bad paint job affect the game I was playing in a negative way. In fact, that they were painted at all made the game feel so much more important. Those were my minis on the table. I spent time with them and painted them the way that I wanted. Knowing that made more of a difference than how good they looked. Of course, the more minis I finished, putting in time and practice, the better I got. Those models looked better, but the games didn't really change. I still felt the same about the nicer minis as I did with some of the first ones when they were on the table. It didn't really scale. I just felt good that they were there and painted. When I started using these new speed paints, there was an interesting thing that happened when I finished a model. I started to realize that the feeling of accomplishment when I decided to call something done was still there, regardless of how much time it took. And I wanted to keep going. And because of the speed factor, I was able to finish models quicker and keep that motivation going. This brings us to these models and how I applied that feeling. Starting to get paint on this Goblin Rider, I decided to approach the painting process a little differently. Sure, I want good results, but for lack of a better way to say it, I want the paint to do the work for me. I know that's really obtuse, but hear me out. Speed paints are designed to go over a light undercoat of paint. In this case, I opted for a mostly zenithal highlight of white ink with an airbrush. So there are some highlights on top and shadows underneath. The transparency of these paints pick up on those gradients, and there is a change in color value from the brightest point down to the darkest. Plus, the way that the paint works is that it settles in the recesses and becomes more opaque, giving us darker, more defined lines as well as some edge highlighting where the paint is thinnest at sharp edges. That all makes sense, but where the paint begins to speak is how it ends up lying on the model. The edges are more defined due to the nature of the paint, so it's clear to see where they are and the type of color you would want to use to highlight those edges. The shadows and recesses are more opaque and defined, so it's defining shapes on things like faces and arms and muscles, showing you exactly where to place the layer of paint and where to avoid. I want to take all of this information, let the paint tell me what to do, and most importantly, really try and enjoy the process of just painting. The speed paints make the process pretty straightforward, and it does take the guesswork out of a lot of it. I laid out all the colors so I could see the labels and a little color swatch on the front. Picked up a few to start and began to lay in some color. The green for the goblin skin did a really good job, getting a nice rich green down on the skin and really defining the muscles all over. It still has that kind of semi-gloss look that I don't particularly like from paints like this, and that's always been kind of a concern for me. But there is a very good way to deal with that and still keeps the process really quick. So we'll get to that. Leather is one of the best materials to paint, especially with this type of paint. It almost doesn't matter what color you pick too, because you can really change the look at any point by adding more of the same color or switching it up and layering over some other types of brown or literally whatever color you want that leather to be. For the most part, staying within the lines is important, but when I was painting the fur, I decided to take some liberties and paint in patches of this dark blue. For the main portions of the fur, it all works as expected. But what surprised me was in getting down towards the little tufts of sculpted fur that are separated from the main parts. Instead of trying to be really clean and only picking out the little plastic hairs, I just covered the entire area. I gave the model a really cool look, like the skin is actually darker where that fur is darker, and not that the hair is just a dark color. So it really added some life to the model. It was also at this point that I started to relax and just put paint on the model. Not being perfectly precise with every brushstroke or placement, but getting color on the model to create an overall look. Much like the models I had practiced on before, just getting paint on the model, finding out where things need to stand out, and eventually getting to the end felt extremely motivating. Just getting this amount of work done in under 15 minutes already helps me get ready for the next model. And using the speed paints has opened up my mind to possibilities that I kind of wrote off for a long time. I've never been of the opinion that contrast paints or speed paints have been bad. In fact, I use them all the time, but for some reason or another, it just really clicked with me this week. Being able to put vibrant full coverage paint on a model and get the base coats quickly knocked out, relatively speaking, gave me a feeling of accomplishment and motivation to want to paint more. On top of that, I was able to take things a step further and do some really fun layering, using what that speed paint gave me to take the minis to the next level. After getting those initial layers down on the model, it's looking pretty good, but it definitely has that contrast look. So you need to add layers on top to get the proper finishes on each part of the model, as well as make the details stand out a bit more. Layering and highlighting each piece on the model after using speed paints is as easy as adding a highlight color to the same speed paint that you already used. So for the leather parts, I added a little bit of ivory and some orange to the mix. Since I like my leather to be on the orangey kind of patchy side of things, those are the colors that I like to use. To start, I like to mix in just a little bit of those colors and go over the majority of the piece I'm working on. Then add a bit more white to that in order to make that paint a little thicker. Repeat this until I have the layer and highlights that I want. All of the time following the lines that the speed paint gave me in the beginning. Like I said, I want the paint to tell me where to go. So anywhere that the paint is getting lighter, I add more highlight color to the mix. And wherever it gets darker, I use the same speed paint color to go over it again, making it more opaque. And in most cases, I push my brush strokes from the lighter areas towards the dark. That way the natural transparency of the speed paint can be used like a glaze and blend the layers together. The skin in particular really stands out on these models and gives what is probably the best example. I'm using a very bright green that has a lot of yellow mixed in. Mixing that into my base speed paint green and going all over the raised areas on the face, arms, and legs, you can clearly see where the speed paint stayed in the recesses, and just avoiding those gives the model a really cool look. I don't have to think about where to place colors pretty much at all. Just follow the guide and paint it in, which is kind of cathartic. Now this video isn't sponsored by the Army Painter in any way, and they didn't ask me to make it. They did send me this box of paints, and I am grateful for that because I'm not sure I would have come to these conclusions without it. The real big takeaway for me here is that really getting into the process while using the speed paints put me in a place where I was having more fun and getting motivated to paint the next model before I even finished the one I was working on. I haven't really felt like that in a while. Now, how quickly these layers went down was definitely a contributing factor, but I think it was more the fact that I was able to finish these minis and actually feel good about where they ended up. Adding in a little bit of highlight color, being almost painterly about the application, was different and made the experience feel more free-flowing and artistic. The best comparison I can honestly make is kind of how Bob Ross stands there and goes, "Alright, I think this feels right," and just picks a color and slaps it down. It's like a flow state for painting, and when it goes right, it feels even better. Most importantly, the fact that I now have a warband for a game that I would like to get into, and done while I'm still interested in trying it out, feels like a huge win. Finished minis, even if they aren't the best, are still so much better than gray plastic, and when you want to play a game, having a painted army or warband is just so much more engaging. You just tend to care about what happens to them a little bit more, and it makes for a much more memorable game. In this case, speed paints unlocked something that I kinda already knew, but it also made me feel like it was possible to have fun painting even more minis, and still get a result that I could be happy with as a painter. Now I know someone out there needs to hear this, so here it goes. Stop worrying about the quality of your work. Just paint and engage with the model in your hands and enjoy the process. Miniature painting takes time to learn, and there are so many people out there that have years of experience doing it. Appreciate their work and learn from their work, but don't compare your journey to anyone else's. Every mistake is worth it because it makes you better on the next model, and every model you complete brings joy and motivation to try harder on the next one. And above all, a painted model, no matter how good or bad, is better than bare plastic. Thank you again for joining me on another miniature rescue. If you like something about this video, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, as it really helps out the channel. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video. And of course, here are the finished Goblin Wolf Riders. Thanks again.